Hello again, you're watching Gravitas. Just as US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson sat down for talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, President Putin said the level of trust, especially on the military level, with the US has deteriorated. Tillerson's reception in Moscow has been dubbed as hostile. The US President's son, Eric Trump, meanwhile, says that these exchanges show there is no backroom dealing between Trump and Putin. And that's exactly why we ask, is the rhetoric on Syria mere shadow boxing to ease the pressure on Trump at a time when his election is being investigated for Russian interference? Here's a report. Until 10 days back, he was described as Donald Trump's most dangerous best friend. As a presidential candidate, Trump praised Vladimir Putin for his very strong control on Russia. As president, his team is being investigated by a Senate committee over allegations that Russia helped him win the election. Trump's Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, received the Order of Friendship from President Putin in 2013. When scheduled, this was going to be a meeting of friends. Until American Tomahawk missiles struck, bombing not just a Syrian airbase, but US-Russia relations too. So much so that the Russian Foreign Ministry said diplomatic ties are the worst since the end of the Cold War.
Our meetings today come at an important moment in the relationship so that we can further clarify areas of common objectives, areas of common interest, even when our tactical approaches may be different. To further clarify areas of sharp difference so that we can better understand why these differences exist and what the prospects for narrowing those differences may be.
Я уже не говорю о том, что помимо заявлений мы наблюдали совсем недавно весьма тревожащие действия, когда была предпринята противоправная атака против Сирии. Мы с вами это обсуждали по телефону. Российское руководство, наш президент уже высказал в этой связи принципиальные оценки.
What changed overnight? President Trump's son Eric says Ivanka Trump had a role.
Ivanka is a mother of 3 kids and she has influence. I'm sure she said, listen, this is horrible stuff. My father will act in times like that.
The US administration, meanwhile, is building a case for Russia's hand in the Idlib gas attack that killed over 80 people. Declassified details from the White House, the State Department and the Pentagon include signals and aerial intelligence combined with local reporting and samples taken from victims. Russia, on the other hand, says it has proof that America is preparing for more such strikes in Syria. And yet, Tillerson is in Moscow to meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, leading to speculation on whether the tough position is just that, positioning. Is this an attempt to deflect heat from the Russia-link investigation and pander to domestic political constituencies by slamming an old foe? Bureau Report, WION. And joining us on this, Dmitry Babich, head of the Russian international news agency Sputnik, and Glenn Carl, former CIA agent and also a security and strategic affairs expert. Good evening again to Glenn and to Dmitry Babich. Let me ask you first, Dmitry, do you believe this is shadow boxing?
Well, I think that the crisis is real, and I don't believe that Trump was merely imitating a strike at the Syrian territory, because 59 Tomahawk missiles, this is serious. And the so-called critics of Mr. Trump, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, the President of France, François Hollande, they immediately supported his strike, even though they have been calling Mr. Trump a threat to European security for 6 months before that. So it looks like these people are even less peaceful than Hillary Clinton. You know, they have been saying that Trump was a threat to peace until he started a war, until he struck a sovereign country. So when he struck by Tomahawk missiles, he became the president of the United States. A very well-known American journalist, Fareed Zakaria, from the New York Times, he literally said on his pages that Trump became the president in the night when he struck Syria. Well, to my mind, this is just hideous. A person who was elected by the United States people, he is not the president, he becomes the president when he kills other people in a sovereign nation. That's just awful to my mind.
Well, it does sound awful the way you put it, but Glenn Carl, that's also killing two birds with one stone. You've got all your coalition allies on board who are finally, accepting that you are the president of the US, and you're also addressing a domestic constituency at a time when you're under pressure for alleged Russian interference in the election.
Well, yes, I think it achieves multiple objectives, or at least moves in the direction of them for Donald Trump. It is a way to parry with some cruise missiles the information, the evidence that continues to amass of Russian complicity with the Trump campaign, the Trump entourage, and quite possibly the administration, certainly the election. So that helps Trump that way. I also think that it was a visceral response by Trump to a horror, and something that most Americans, not all, from left and right, have thought was a necessary step. I'm not expressing a personal view on this right now, to try to stop any party from crossing the line of using chemical weapons. So it does achieve a number of things. The statements that it made him president, whether it was right, wrong, is debatable, but he acted, and rather than simply being the subject of all sorts of criticisms and feckless activity on his part.
And the damage could have been much more.
It does a number of things. Yep.
The damage could have been much more. Russia was, we understand, informed well in advance before the missiles were launched. So is this playing to the galleries then? Would you agree?
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. The United States doesn't have any desire of having a military conflict or completely destroying relations with Russia. So a lot of this is this 98% is a signal to Assad and to others that the chemical weapons are beyond the pale, across the line, as the term goes. Had we wanted it to be a far more truly effective military step, you don't tell anybody that you do it beforehand so that they can walk away and avoid being hurt. So yes, it is a statement rather than an attempt to kill Russian military personnel or even Syrians.
Dmitry Babich, you say the crisis is real. When the Russian Foreign Ministry says this is the worst in terms of diplomatic relations since the end of the Cold War, do you think it's an exaggeration?
Well, I don't think it's an exaggeration. Relations have been souring for many years, but especially the second term of Mr. Obama was disastrous. And let me point your attention to the fact that the United States was the initiator of the so-called reforms or regime changes which led to this crisis. It was not Russia who started the Maidan rebellion in Ukraine. It was the United States and the EU that supported it. Also, talking about the Russian complicity in the American election, well, I think it's just laughable. And I don't think we're going to hear much about it, because how can Trump be a Russian agent and at the same time, how can he bomb, the air bases where Russian helicopters and Russian planes could be located? As for warning the Russian side in advance about the strike, I think it was just responsible, because let me remind you, the Russian Air Force in Syria is on legal grounds. It was invited by the Syrian government. There are only two variants how a foreign force can be legally inside a sovereign country. It can be there on a UN mandate, or it can be invited by the local government. The US Special Forces were there illegally, and they are there illegally. The US airstrike, these Tomahawk missiles, they were fired illegally. So it's in the interest of the huge majority of the countries of the world to restore international order and to stop the United States from using its military force indiscriminately.
But then we're talking only about U.S. and Russia, and when I say U.S., only about Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Until 10 days back, they were seen as friends. Until 10 days back, Donald Trump said that removing Assad is not a priority. Something changed overnight. Equally implausible is the theory that Ivanka Trump saw images coming out of Idlib and said this cannot be happening, and then they fired missiles.
Well, I think this is all not serious. You know, first, what you said, that Putin and Trump are getting along very well. Well, that's the issue.
Right, we seem to have lost the link. Very quickly, Glenn Carl, I want to wrap, but I also want to ask you, what do you see coming out of this meeting between Tillerson and Lavrov?
Oh boy! Coming out of that, this is it's easier to talk about convict the spies who are going to be executed than to try to figure out what comes out of Moscow. I don't see prospects for much improvement of relations right now. I mean, this is a frosty moment. Yes. I would like to make one point I think is important that Dmitry raised. Of course, I completely disagree with his characterization, but that is the nature of espionage and the fact. Spies do contradictory things all the time. You never want to say, you know, I am a Russian agent, and so everything I do, therefore, will be pro-Russian, because obviously I will appear to be a Russian agent. And the government is much larger than any individual. So there will be contradictory actions taken, to include bombing interests of Russia. So that doesn't discredit anything of the overwhelming evidence of Russian involvement in the American electoral process and with Trump.
All right. Dmitry Babich, the same question to you. At a time when there's so much hostility, at a time when they sit down for a meeting and Vladimir Putin goes on a television interview and says the relations are very bad, especially on a military level, why are they even talking and what is expected to come out?
Well, I can tell you that first, President Putin, it's not yet clear whether he will meet Rex Tillerson or not. Foreign ministers have been negotiating for 5 hours, very politely, in a friendly atmosphere. But of course, if Mr. Tillerson has just come to make ultimatums, Putin is not going to meet him, because that is Putin's strategy. He never makes concessions under pressure. He can make a concession if you behave yourself, if you don't pressure him, if you ask politely, he can make a concession. But he never makes concessions when you threaten him or Russia. That was the case with Chechen terrorists. That was the case with Obama. That's going to be the case with Trump also. And it's not immediately clear what Mr. Tillerson will offer Russia in exchange for what he calls abandoning Assad. The London Times, you know, the newspaper, they wrote that Mr. Tillerson could suggest that Russia could return to G7, making it G8 again, you know, the group of so-called industrialized nations. But Russia doesn't want back to G8. G8 is irrelevant. It reflects the realities of 1970s, not of the current times. How can you decide the fates of the world without China, without India, without Russia, without Brazil? So Russia doesn't want back to G8, and if Mr. Tillerson is going to suggest that, he's not going to get what he wants.
Well, if he or his team is watching this broadcast, this is the bit of advice for them. Ask politely. Glenn Carl, Dmitry Babich, thanks very much for joining us this evening on Gravitas.